Skills shortage and the lack of technical capacity within the public sector is a huge problem in South Africa. It does not only affect the quality of service delivery, but also limits economic growth. This contributes to the already large volumes of unemployment and poverty. It was recently reported that the Department of Water and Sanitation will be spending around 35 million rands on 35 Cuban engineers over the next 2 years. The recruited Cuban specialists include civil, electrical, mechanical, and hydraulic engineers, as well as irrigation and drainage specialists. The arrival of the Cuban specialists has been met with harsh and widespread criticism from engineering authorities and institutions in the country. They have distanced themselves from the deal, questioning its effectiveness and sustainability. The department has defended their import as a calculated response to their skills and capacity challenges. We spoke to Manglin Pillay, Chief Executive Officer of the South African Institution of Civil Engineering, to help us unpack some of the concerns around this controversy.
Well, the department, it's public knowledge that the department is challenged in terms of capacity. They lack in terms of number of engineers that they're able to attract. I think we need to be very clear right up front that we're not against Cuban engineers practicing in South Africa. Just like we're not against engineers from the UK or from Australia or Canada or anywhere coming to work in South Africa. In fact, we want everybody to play in the South African space. What we are challenging is the lack of appreciation or the lack of utilization of our local engineering skills. We've got world-class engineers that produce world-class infrastructure in South Africa. You just have to take a look at our infrastructure, and we've got world-class infrastructure. We need to attract those engineers back into the public sector. So it must be upfront. We're not dealing with a Cuban engineering issue here. We're dealing with the underutilization of local civil engineering or local general engineering capacity. It must be said also that our engineers are sought after around the world. Our engineers are working in the Middle East, they're working in Australia, they're working in the UK. But that appreciation for our local engineers is not enjoyed here in South Africa. And it's those sort of issues that we would like to deal with. There is messages from our politicians that there's unemployment in the country. There's also messages from our consulting bodies, consulting engineering bodies, that say around 40% of our consulting engineering skills are underutilized. On specifically the Cuban engineers, there are some points that we need, points of concern that we need to unfold or unpack. The first being that the Cuban engineers, or Cuba, is not part of the Washington Accord. Now, the Washington Accord is an international agreement around education, engineering education. And Cuba is not part of that Washington Accord, whereas South Africa is. So we want to send a message that in South Africa we want professionally registered engineers to participate in engineering work. Now, if the Cuban engineers are not party to this agreement, it's going to be difficult for them to register with the Engineering Council. And we want registered professionals to work in the public sector as well as in the private sector, but more so in the public sector, where the challenge, as the National Development Plan talks about, the challenge on professionalizing the public sector. If we don't bring in professionals registered with EXA to work in the public sector, then we're saying one thing in the National Development Plan and we're doing another thing when we're actually employing people. That's the first issue. The second issue is the language barrier. Cubans speak Spanish. Our language of business is English. Cubans do speak English, but it's not their first language. Now, this contributes to understanding our design codes, our systems, our processes, our guidelines, our standardized documents for engineering, and that's going to prove to be a problem. A third issue is around the systems and structures around which we do engineering business. It must be stated that the Cubans come from a socialist, communist environment, whereas in South Africa we're a modern democracy. We function in a capitalist environment. Now, the language, the issue around the system, the political system and regime under which we operate, those things will need to come to terms, the Cubans will need to come to terms with over a period of time. But the Cuban engineers are here for just 2 years. It's going to take them about a year just to come to be familiar with this engineering business environment. By the time they're actually useful to us in South Africa, it's going to be time to go back home. 35 million rand wasted. There are messages that we're also sending to our local engineers who are working in South Africa and working outside of South Africa, that our politicians are sending by embarking on this process. And the message is that local engineers, you are not valued. It's a subtle message that we would, instead of attracting local engineers and making the environment suitable for local engineers, we will simply get engineers from another environment to come and take your place. That's the wrong message that we're sending. And finally, there's the opportunity cost. For every million rand that is spent on a Cuban engineer, the opportunity cost is too high. The opportunity cost is the lack of spending on a local engineer, lack of training opportunities, lack of development opportunities for a local engineer to progress in the South African context. So with all of these things, it makes sense to not bring external engineers and to utilize local engineers first. Well, firstly, let's say that we believe we have sufficient engineering capacity in the country, which is what I've been talking about earlier. The challenge is that they're sitting in the private sector and not in the public sector. And let's look at what exactly what engineers do in the public sector. Now, if we take a local municipality, for example, a big part of what local municipalities do is deliver services related to civil engineering infrastructure, roads, electricity, public transportation, hospitals, schools. Now, all of that requires infrastructure, so one could draw the conclusion that service delivery requires engineers to be part of that delivery mechanism. Now, when engineers are employed in the public sector, like the municipality or at a national or provincial level, we expect them, it's not unfair to expect that engineers must be involved in decision making. One of the reasons that engineers are doubtful or are not attracted to the public sector is that their decision making powers are limited or being tainted by political decision making. It's being interfered with. So the work of the engineer is actually stifled. As a result, he would rather be working in the private sector than in the public sector. So we need to work and collaborate with government so that we can change that situation or have a conversation around how we could best have the two views in collaboration in order to achieve service delivery. There's been a call by the National Development Plan. Secondly, there's been a call by the National Development Plan to professionalize the public sector. Now, one must understand that engineering professionals, that's exactly what they are. They're professionals. They want to work in the context and an environment that is professional, that looks professional, that does work professionally, that has excellent management systems, processes and that are in place, or if not, to allow engineers to install those processes. Now, that's missing in the public sector. So we need, as a second intervention, is to professionalize the public sector, or allow the engineers to assist in the professionalizing of the public sector. A third issue that needs to be addressed is the career pathing for engineers. Now, if one had to consider that 80% or more than 80% of infrastructure spend in this country comes from the public sector, it's fair to assume that the public sector should be the highest employer of engineering professionals. And to attract or to sustain that that situation, one needs to bring in younger engineers to learn from senior engineers and to ensure that that continues on a regular basis. Now, with the lack of senior engineering capacity in the public sector, younger engineers are not receiving training, they're not receiving adequate work experience, so their entire development spectrum is damaged. So there's no career pathing, there's no scope for promotion, there's no future in terms of an engineering profession, an engineering career in the public sector. We need to change that. Finally, there's the interference by other departments. I mentioned earlier the role of the delivery mechanism, and it's largely around infrastructure. But instead of infrastructure and service delivery taking priority, it's the HR and the finance departments that actually rule the show in terms of service delivery. Now, we don't want to create conflict with the HR people or with the finance people, but we need to come up with a mechanism or some sort of collaboration where there's clear understanding that the main purpose is not HR. The main purpose is deliver infrastructure. And we can't have HR dominating, or finance departments or finance officials or politicians for that matter dominating. It does not make sense. It absolutely does not make sense. But we do advocate for a collaborative process to occur where there's sharing of information and so on. But to answer your question directly, it is for these reasons that the engineering professionals prefer to work in the private sector and not in the public sector. Very interesting to note that salary, a study was done as to why these professionals are not working in the public sector. Salary did not feature high. Salary featured, of the 10 items that featured, salary featured around number 6 or number 7. So salary is not the issue. In fact, the salaries that are offered in the public sector, they could be higher, as salaries are always viewed, but it's not a dominating issue. It's career pathing, it's a lack of professionalism, it's the interference by HR and politicians and finance. It's those issues that we need to resolve. Some of the challenges that need to be overcome to make this successful is that the engineers that are here from Cuba, or the professionals that are here from Cuba, need to register with the relevant engineering bodies. That's our first port of call, because we want to send the right message. We want professionals working in the public sector. And the second thing that needs to happen is perhaps a collaboration with our local engineers, so that exchange of knowledge in terms of our systems, our processes, our codes, our guideline documents, that knowledge is actually passed on to the Cuban professionals. I think a big part of that process is assessing that the Cuban engineers are actually doing productive work, and they're not stashed away in some corner where they're hidden and they're not being monitored, and not doing the work that the department aspired for them to do. I do believe with some effort that it could be successful, but in light of everything that I've shared with you, I think it's written on the wall. We're not convinced that this is going to be a success story. that our government or our country can paint that it's been highly successful. What would be successful is utilization of local skills, our local graduates, technicians, technologists, and engineers, and to get them trained, because we believe they understand and can operate the best in the local environment from which they emanate. Right. The department has come up with a solution, and it's in its mind this is the best solution for the challenge that they're facing. We're saying that you haven't consulted, the department has not consulted with the local engineering bodies that govern infrastructure and construction in the built environment. The Engineering Council, for example, the Council for the Built Environment, the engineering institutions like the South African Institution of Civil Engineering, and others, mechanicals, the electricals, and so on. Now, that's a huge gap in the process that they've taken to capacitate their officers. That conversation needs to start. And government needs to see the engineering institutions as an ally, and not an organization, or not organizations that are constantly confronting. That's not how it is. But government needs to open those doors more for the engineering institutions to collaborate with the directors general, with the HODs, the senior directors, head of technical services, to collaborate and to work together with them, for example, to identify individuals that may wish to go back into the public sector. We've done an interesting study here at SAICE, the South African Institution of Civil Engineering, to determine the sentiment of our members towards working in the public sector. An interesting result came up. 40% of our members are actually quite excited about working in the public sector, provided that we meet these challenges that I've discussed. So it's not beyond our members to participate. It's the wrong message that our government is sending, our officials are sending, in that we don't want to work with local capacity, we want to work rather with international capacity. So we've, as SAICE, we've invited ourselves over to the ministerial offices, we've put out media releases, and we will continue to do that. We would encourage the senior officials in the department to invite us and to collaborate with us and to work with us to bring in the right capacity.